Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. Flathead National Forest had always been our sanctuary. It was where my father, Dennis, had taught me everything that mattered: how to track, how to read the wind, how to survive when civilization felt like a distant memory. Every autumn for the past 15 years, we'd abandoned our comfortable lives in Missoula and disappeared into Montana's unforgiving backcountry for elk season. Dennis, now 63, carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent 3 decades charging into burning buildings as a firefighter. Retirement hadn't softened him one bit. His weathered hands could still field dress an elk faster than men half his age, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing in the wilderness we both loved. At 28, my work as a paramedic kept me tethered to the city, responding to overdoses and car wrecks, watching people destroy themselves in ways that made no sense. These annual trips felt like oxygen to a drowning man, pure, necessary, life-sustaining. This October, we'd chosen new territory. Dennis had gotten a tip from an outfitter buddy about a remote valley near the southern edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. "Trophy bulls," he'd said, eyes gleaming. "Barely any hunting pressure. You'll need to hike in deep, but it's worth every step." 2 brutal days of hiking through unmarked terrain brought us to our destination. The valley stretched before us like something from a postcard, granite peaks piercing low-hanging clouds, pristine streams cutting through stands of ancient spruce and Douglas fir. We made camp near the timberline, where a crystal-clear creek wound between moss-covered boulders. That first evening, as we planned our strategy over instant coffee and trail mix, the forest seemed to welcome us. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called softly. Water trickled over stones. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. Dennis spread out his topographical map, pointing to a shallow basin nestled between thick timber stands about a mile deeper into the wilderness. "I glassed elk up there this afternoon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Big bull, probably a 6-point, maybe better. If we position ourselves right, we'll have meat in the cooler by tomorrow night." I nodded, feeling that familiar pre-hunt excitement building in my chest. We'd done this dance so many times before. I trusted his instincts completely. As we settled into our sleeping bags, the temperature dropped quickly. October nights in the high country could be brutal, and this one felt particularly sharp. I lay awake for a while, listening to the creek and watching stars appear between passing clouds. Everything felt perfect. Normal. Safe. How wrong I was. Dawn broke cold and gray, with fog hanging thick between the trees like smoke from some massive unseen fire. Dennis and I moved through the mist like ghosts, our boots silent on the frost-covered ground. I carried my Winchester .300 Magnum, a rifle that had never failed me. Dennis shouldered his beloved Remington .30-06, the same gun he'd used to take dozens of elk over the years. We'd barely cleared the tree line when Dennis grabbed my arm, pointing silently toward the basin. Through the swirling fog, I could make out the shadowy forms of a small herd. The bull stood apart from the cows, massive and magnificent, his antlers spreading like the branches of some ancient tree. My heart hammered against my ribs as I settled into position behind a fallen log. Dennis knelt beside me, glassing the animal through his binoculars. 8 points, he whispered. Maybe 9. Take your time. I controlled my breathing, settling the crosshairs just behind the bull's front shoulder. The animal stood perfectly still, as if posing for the shot. I squeezed the trigger slowly, steadily, the way Dennis had taught me 20 years ago. The rifle's report echoed off the granite walls like thunder. The bull dropped immediately, cleanly. The rest of the herd scattered into the timber, white tails flashing as they disappeared. "Beautiful shot," Dennis said, clapping me on the shoulder. We approached the animal with the reverence it deserved. The bull was enormous, easily 700 pounds of prime meat. His antlers were even more impressive up close, 9 points of polished bone that would look magnificent mounted in my living room. The work began immediately. Field dressing an animal this size was backbreaking labor, but we'd done it countless times. Dennis worked with practiced efficiency, making precise cuts while I helped position the carcass. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the clean mountain air, sharp and primal. By the time we finished, the sun was dropping toward the western peaks. We loaded the quarters into game bags, heavy white canvas sacks that would protect the meat from flies and contamination. Using a rope and pulley system, we hoisted the bags 15 feet up into a massive ponderosa pine, well beyond the reach of any ground-dwelling scavenger. That should keep the bears away, Dennis said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. He tied off the rope securely around the tree's base, testing the knots twice. As we hiked back to camp, exhaustion weighed heavy on my shoulders. It had been a perfect day, the kind of hunt you remember for the rest of your life. Clean kill, good meat, time spent with my father in the place we both loved most. That night, as we sat around our small campfire eating dehydrated stew, the forest felt different somehow. The normal sounds seemed muted, subdued. Even the creek appeared to run more quietly, as if the water itself was holding back. Just before we turned in, a sharp crack echoed from the direction of our kill site. It was loud and unnatural, like a gunshot but sharper, more brittle. Probably just a tree splitting from the cold, Dennis said, but I caught the uncertainty in his voice. I stared into the darkness beyond our fire's glow, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us from the black spaces between the trees. Morning came with a bitter chill that cut right through my sleeping bag. Frost covered everything, our tent, our gear, even the inside of my coffee cup. Dennis was already up, moving around camp with quick, efficient motions that spoke of military training from his younger days. "Sleep okay?" he asked, though his eyes told me he already knew the answer. "Not really," I admitted. "Kept hearing things. Probably nothing." We broke camp quickly and headed back toward our kill site, both of us eager to get the meat loaded and start the long hike out. The forest seemed even quieter than the night before. No birds, no chittering squirrels, just the crunch of our boots on frost-covered leaves and the sound of our own breathing. When we reached the ponderosa pine, my stomach dropped like a stone. The tree stood empty. The rope lay on the ground in a tangled mess, frayed and snapped. No blood, no scraps of canvas, nothing. "What the hell?" Dennis whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. We circled the tree like crime scene investigators, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. That's when I saw them. 4 parallel grooves carved deep into the bark, starting at least 8 feet off the ground and running down to eye level. The cuts were fresh, sap still bleeding slowly from the wounded wood. "Bear couldn't reach that high," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Dennis knelt at the base of the tree, pointing to disturbed ground that led away into the darker timber. "Something dragged it off this way." We followed the trail for 50 yards, watching the drag marks grow fainter with each step until they disappeared completely into undisturbed forest floor. No carcass, no bones, no sign that 300 pounds of meat had ever existed. A soft rustle somewhere ahead made us both freeze. I raised my rifle instinctively, finger finding the trigger. We waited, barely breathing, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The forest held an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. "We should head back," Dennis said quietly. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to retreat. As we walked back toward camp, I couldn't shake the image of those claw marks. Too high, too deep, too precise. Whatever had taken our meat wasn't just hungry. It was something else entirely. We spent the afternoon in tense preparation, checking and rechecking our rifles, organizing our gear, building up our campfire until it blazed higher than necessary. Neither of us spoke about what we'd found, but the questions hung between us like smoke. Dennis cleaned his rifle for the third time, running the cleaning rod through the barrel with mechanical precision. I busied myself gathering extra firewood, building a pile large enough to last all night. The physical activity helped calm my nerves, but it couldn't quiet the nagging voice in my head that kept whispering warnings. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. Our breath came out in visible puffs, and the creek began forming ice at its edges. We sat close to the fire, rifles across our knees, listening to every sound in the forest around us. "You think it was a bear?" I asked, though I already knew his answer. Dennis shook his head slowly. "I've been hunting these mountains for 40 years, never seen anything like those marks." Around midnight, a sound echoed from deep in the timber, a low, haunting call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It rose and fell like wind through a canyon, but there was something almost musical about it, deliberate and controlled. "Jesus," I whispered, then caught myself. God almighty, what was that? Dennis gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white in the firelight. I have no idea. The calls continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough to make us both stand up, sometimes so distant they might have been imagination. When they finally stopped, the silence felt worse than the noise. I stood up to relieve myself, walking behind our tent toward the creek. My flashlight beam swept across the soft ground near the water's edge, and I nearly cried out. Footprints, massive, elongated impressions pressed deep into the moss. They were at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with what looked like toe marks at the front. Too big for a person, wrong shape for a bear. They led along the creek bank before disappearing into the rocky shallows. Dennis took one look and cursed under his breath. Pack everything. We're leaving at first light. What about hiking out in the dark? Too dangerous. But we're not spending another night here after tomorrow. We retreated to our tent and zipped it shut, as if a layer of nylon could protect us from whatever was stalking us through the wilderness. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every small sound made my heart race. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl that might not have been an owl at all. Sometime around 3 a.m, heavy footsteps began circling our tent. Slow, deliberate, methodical. I could hear deep breathing just inches from my head, separated only by the thin fabric of our shelter. Dennis lay rigid beside me, his rifle at the ready, finger on the trigger. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent's entrance. Something sniffed loudly, making deep guttural sounds that were almost like speech, but not quite. I held my breath until my lungs burned, terrified that even the smallest movement would provoke whatever was out there. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated into the night. Neither Dennis nor I spoke until dawn. Dawn brought no relief from our terror, only the opportunity to escape. We broke camp in record time, shoving gear into our packs without regard for organization or comfort. All that mattered was getting out of this valley before nightfall. Dennis consulted his GPS and pointed toward the granite ridges rising above us. There's a lake up there about 2 miles. Good landing spot for a float plane. If we can get a satellite signal, we can call for extraction. My legs felt like lead as we began climbing, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind us, the valley floor seemed to pulse with malevolent life. I kept glancing back, expecting to see something massive and dark following our trail. The ascent was brutal. Steep terrain covered in loose rock and deadfall made every step treacherous. My pack straps cut into my shoulders, and sweat soaked through my shirt despite the freezing air. Dennis, despite his age, moved with the steady determination of a man who'd faced worse things than fear. "You okay back there?" he called over his shoulder. "Fine," I lied, gasping for breath in the thin air. We climbed through stands of stunted alpine fir, across boulder fields that shifted and clattered under our boots. up grassy slopes that turned to scree and finally to bare rock. With each step higher, the valley below looked smaller and more innocent, just another pretty wilderness area that thousands of hikers enjoyed every year. But I knew better now. Some places weren't meant for human visitors. After 3 hours of steady climbing, we reached a small plateau overlooking an alpine lake. The water was deep blue-black, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Perfect for a float plane landing. Dennis pulled out his satellite beacon, a device we'd never needed before in all our years of hunting. His hands shook slightly as he powered it on and waited for a signal. "Come on," he muttered, watching the display flicker between one bar and nothing. Finally, a steady signal appeared. Dennis activated the emergency beacon, transmitting our coordinates to the rescue service in Kalispell. Within minutes, his radio crackled to life. "Beacon 774, this is Mountain Rescue. We have your position. Can you confirm emergency status?" "Confirmed," Dennis replied. "2 hunters requesting immediate extraction. We can reach the lake in 30 minutes. "Roger that. We have a pilot en route. ETA approximately 2 hours." Relief flooded through me like warm water. We were getting out. Whatever was hunting us in the valley below couldn't follow us home, or so I hoped. While we waited for our rescue, Dennis and I made our way down to the lakeshore. The water was crystal clear, so pure I could see trout swimming in the depths 20 feet below the surface. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. I was scanning the sky for any sign of an approaching aircraft when something caught my eye in the valley below. From our elevated position, I had a perfect view of the basin where we'd killed the elk, and what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. Our elk carcass hung suspended in a tree at least 20 feet off the ground. Not dragged up, hung. Deliberately positioned with the precision of someone arranging a piece of art. The animal was gutted and cleaned, its hide stretched between branches like some grotesque banner. "Dennis," I whispered, pointing down into the valley. He followed my gaze and cursed softly. "What kind of animal does that?" It wasn't a question that expected an answer. We both knew that no bear, no mountain lion, no known predator would hang its prey like a trophy. This was something else. Something that thought. Something that planned. The display below wasn't random or instinctive. It was a message. A warning. Or maybe just the artistic expression of something so alien to human understanding that we couldn't begin to comprehend its motivations. I thought about the footprints by the creek, the deliberate way whatever it was had circled our tent, the almost musical quality of those haunting calls. This wasn't just a predator. This was intelligence, consciousness. Something that had been watching us, studying us, playing with us like a cat plays with a mouse. The sound of an approaching engine broke through my horrified fascination. A small red and white float plane appeared over the eastern ridge, banking toward the lake in a wide circle. I had never been so happy to see another human being in my entire life. "Thank God," Dennis breathed, waving his orange jacket over his head. The pilot, a weathered man named Ray who'd been flying rescue missions in these mountains for 30 years, taxied to within 20 feet of shore. We waded out through the shockingly cold water and scrambled onto the pontoons, then into the cramped cockpit. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," Ray observed as he pushed the throttle forward. "Something like that," Dennis replied. As we lifted off and banked away from the valley, I caught one last glimpse of our elk hanging in the tree below. Even from this distance, I could see that it was positioned to be clearly visible from above. A deliberate display, a final message from whatever had been stalking us. The message was simple. We know you were here. We let you leave. This time. We landed at Kalispell 40 minutes later, and I had never been so grateful to feel solid ground under my feet. Ray helped us unload our gear, asking no questions about why we'd needed emergency extraction. Mountain pilots develop a kind of wisdom about when not to pry. Dennis and I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, a small log building on the outskirts of town staffed by two young rangers who looked fresh out of college. We tried to explain what we'd experienced, but even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how insane they sounded. "So you're reporting that an unknown animal stole your elk and hung it in a tree?" the first ranger asked, pen poised over his incident report form. "That's right," Dennis said firmly, along with unusual track marks and vocalizations we couldn't identify. The rangers exchanged glances. "Did you get any photographs of these tracks or the hanging carcass?" "We hadn't, of course. When you're fleeing for your life, documentation isn't your first priority." "We'll file a report," the second ranger said diplomatically. "Fish and Wildlife might want to investigate if there's an unknown predator in the area." But I could see in their eyes that nothing would come of it. Two hunters with an impossible story and no evidence. They probably dealt with reports like this all the time. People who'd spent too many nights alone in the wilderness and let their imaginations run wild. We didn't push it. What was the point? Even if they believed us, what could they do? Post warnings about an unidentified intelligence lurking in remote valleys? Send in research teams to investigate something that clearly didn't want to be found? On the drive back to Missoula, Dennis was quiet for a long time. Finally, as we passed through the Flathead Reservation, he spoke. "In 30 years of fighting fires, I've seen things that would give most people nightmares," he said. "Bodies burned beyond recognition, buildings collapsed with people still inside. But I've never felt terror like I felt in that valley." "Because fires and building collapses make sense," I replied. "You can understand them, fight them, overcome them. But whatever was in those woods was smarter than us," Dennis finished, "and it wanted us to know it." We drove the rest of the way home in silence, both of us lost in thoughts we couldn't quite articulate. The familiar sights of civilization, gas stations, fast food restaurants, traffic lights, felt surreal after what we'd experienced. How could normal life just continue when something like that existed in the wilderness just a few hours away? Weeks passed before I could sleep through the night without jerking awake at every small sound. Even in my comfortable apartment in Missoula, surrounded by the noise and light of the city, I found myself checking locks and peering out windows at the slightest provocation. Dennis and I didn't talk about our experience directly, but we both knew our hunting days in remote areas were over. We started taking trips to more populated hunting grounds, areas with established outfitters and regular ranger patrols. It wasn't the same, but it was safe. Then, about a month after our rescue, I received a disturbing phone call. A friend who worked for Fish and Wildlife told me that another hunting party had found remains in the same valley where we'd been camping. Not human remains, the elk we'd killed, or what was left of it. "Strangest thing," he said. The bones were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern around the base of a tree. Skull was missing entirely. Fresh claw marks on every surface, but too high up for any known predator. Your names came up in connection with a report filed in Kalispell. I thanked him for the information and hung up, hands shaking slightly. Whatever had been stalking us was still there, still playing its incomprehensible games with anyone foolish enough to enter its territory. That night I sat in my living room with all the lights on, thinking about intelligence and wilderness and the comfortable assumptions we make about our place in the natural world. We like to believe that humans are the apex predators, the dominant species, the masters of our environment. But somewhere in the remote valleys of Montana, something else rules. Something older, smarter, and infinitely more patient than we are. Something that watches. Something that waits. Something that hangs elk carcasses in trees like territorial markers, warning other apex predators to stay away. Dennis was right. We should never go back there. But sometimes, late at night when sleep refuses to come, I find myself wondering if that thing from the valley might someday decide to come looking for us instead. The thought terrifies me, But what terrifies me even more is the growing certainty that it already knows exactly where to find us. And it's just waiting for the right moment to make its next move. The hunt, I realize now, is far from over. I was about 9 the Thanksgiving we arrived at Grandma's place. Nothing but trees surrounding that old house so thick you could hardly see the sky. The driveway felt longer than usual, like it stretched deeper into some secret place. Grandma's house always felt a bit strange, with all those Native American masks hanging on the walls, and the faint smell of incense or something that hinted at old ceremonies. Whenever I stepped inside, I half expected those masks to whisper warnings I couldn't quite catch. The house itself seemed to breathe with age. Every floorboard groaned under our feet, and the walls held photographs from decades past, their subjects watching us with faded eyes. The kitchen smelled of sage and old wood smoke mixed with whatever Grandma had been cooking. She kept bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and clay pots filled with things I couldn't identify lined the windowsills. Thanksgiving meant cousins everywhere, piling coats in the hallway and chatting so loud it drowned out any sense of caution. Aunt Sandy was setting the table. Uncle Jim rummaged around in the fridge, and everyone else drifted in and out of conversation. I remember glancing out the back window, noticing how dark the woods looked even in daylight. The branches gnarled like they'd been there for centuries. The property stretched back farther than anyone really knew. Grandma said her family had owned it for 3 generations, but the deed went back even further than that. There were stories about the people who lived here before, the ones who left behind arrowheads and broken pottery in the creek beds. Sometimes I'd find strange markings on trees deep in the woods, symbols carved into bark that had grown thick and distorted around them. My younger sister Marie clung to Mom's leg, overwhelmed by all the noise and activity. She was only 6 and still believed that staying close to grown-ups meant staying safe. I envied that certainty. At 9, I'd started noticing things that made me question whether adults really had all the answers, like the way Grandma would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare out the window, or how Uncle Jim always locked his car doors the second he parked, even though we were miles from any neighbors. My older cousin Sam caught my stare and raised an eyebrow, like he knew I was thinking about exploring. Sam was 12, old enough to act like he knew everything but young enough to still want adventures. His red hair stuck up at odd angles, and he had this way of grinning that made you want to follow him, even when you suspected it was a bad idea. Once we wolfed down some snacks, Sam nudged me to head outside. Mom gave a half-hearted wave to go have fun, maybe expecting we'd just skip rocks in the creek or pick up arrowheads along the usual path. Instead, Sam wanted to push deeper. He'd heard there was a massive rock ledge somewhere far behind the house, and he was determined to find it. "Come on," he said, stuffing his pockets with leftover dinner rolls. "We've got hours before dark. Besides, what else are we gonna do? Sit around and listen to Aunt Sandy talk about her bunions?" I grabbed my jacket, the thick one with the broken zipper that always stuck halfway up. The November air had teeth to it, the kind of cold that crept through your clothes and settled in your bones. We slipped out the back door while the adults were distracted by some story Uncle Jim was telling about a fishing trip gone wrong. The air in those woods was thicker than I remembered. Every footstep sank in damp leaves, and the silence pressed in around us until it felt like we were tiptoeing through someone else's territory. We passed the old sweat lodge structure with rotting hides still clinging to a wooden frame. I'd always been too nervous to peek inside. Even now I sped up to get away from it. Sam didn't say anything, but I saw him glance over his shoulder like he expected someone to emerge from that sagging doorway. The deeper we went, the stranger everything became. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead like fingers. Moss covered everything in a thick green carpet that muffled our steps. I noticed bones scattered here and there, small ones from rabbits or squirrels, picked clean and bleached white. Normal forest stuff, I told myself. But the way they were arranged sometimes looked almost deliberate, like someone had placed them in patterns. "You ever wonder why Grandma never comes back here?" Sam asked suddenly, his voice too loud in the quiet. I hadn't thought about it before, but he was right. Grandma knew every inch of her garden, could name every plant and tell you what it was good for. But I'd never seen her venture past the tree line. She'd stand at the edge sometimes, looking in, but never stepping through. "Maybe she's just old," I offered, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. Grandma was in her 70s, but still split her own firewood and climbed ladders to clean gutters. Sam shook his head. "Nah, it's something else. My dad told me once that something happened back here when he was a kid. Someone went missing or something. He wouldn't give me details." After what felt like forever, we saw a rocky ledge jutting out ahead. It towered over a slope filled with broken branches and dead foliage. Sam and I stood there, kind of breathless, scanning the drop below. The ledge was even more impressive than Sam had imagined. A sheer face of granite that must have been 30 feet high. Water seeped through cracks in the stone, leaving dark stains that looked like dried blood in the fading light. That's where I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a person standing in ragged clothes, maybe 30 feet down. At first, I thought it might be a hiker who'd gotten lost, or maybe some homeless person who'd wandered too far from town. But the stillness of it, the way it stood without swaying or shifting weight, made my skin crawl. I remember trying to blink it away, maybe a scarecrow or some lost hiker who never made it out. But then it moved. I barely breathed. Sam's eyes went wide. The figure turned, letting us see its face. It was long and shaped like a moose's snout, with rough mottled fur in these eerie dark eye sockets. It gazed straight at us, like it knew exactly who we were and that we'd made a terrible mistake stepping this far into its domain. The thing's body was wrong in every way. Too tall, maybe 8 feet, with limbs that bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Its hands, if you could call them that, ended in long fingers tipped with what looked like broken antler points. The ragged clothes I'd first noticed weren't clothes at all, but strips of hide and fur hanging from its frame like a mockery of human dress. When it moved, it didn't walk like a person or an animal. It sort of flowed, each movement deliberate and unnatural. Its head tilted to one side, studying us, and I swear I could feel its attention like cold fingers pressed against my skull. The worst part was its mouth. When it opened, I expected to see teeth, but instead there were just rows of darkness, as if its throat went on forever. My insides nearly locked up. I had this wordless instinct screaming to run, but no part of me wanted to make a sound. Sam grabbed my arm. We bolted back the way we came, crashing through undergrowth. Twigs sliced at my cheeks, and damp leaves stuck to my clothes. With every step, I felt a presence behind me, as though the thing below the ledge had silently decided we weren't allowed to leave. The light through the canopy seemed to flicker, and the trees around us twisted into shapes I barely recognized. We stumbled onto a clearing that shouldn't have been there, an open circle of grass and mushrooms arranged in rings. A weird green glow hung in the air, and a sudden wave of warmth made my head swim. It felt like the whole place was pulling me in, urging me to slow down, to forget why I was running. The mushrooms weren't like any I'd seen before. They pulsed with their own light, and when I looked closer, I could see veins running through them, pumping some kind of luminescent fluid. The grass in the center of the clearing was dead, burned in a perfect circle, and the air above it shimmered like heat waves off hot asphalt. Sam shook my shoulder, his voice tense. We needed to move, but I couldn't figure out where to go. The brush we'd cut through had simply vanished. Every direction looked the same, trees forming an impenetrable wall around us. The clearing itself seemed to be expanding, or maybe we were shrinking. My sense of scale kept shifting, making me dizzy. "This isn't right," Sam whispered, and I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. "We came from that way, I'm sure of it." But when we tried to leave in that direction, We found ourselves back in the center of the clearing. It was like one of those dreams where you run and run but never get anywhere. The warmth was getting stronger, making my eyelids heavy. Part of me wanted to just lie down in the soft grass and sleep. The thought terrified me even as it tempted me. Then a shout cut through everything. My mother's voice echoed in the distance, calling my name. It snapped me back to reality. The spell, or whatever it was, broke like glass. The clearing suddenly looked normal again, just a patch of forest floor with some old mushrooms. The way out was obvious, a clear path between two oak trees. We scrambled out of that clearing, following her voice until we burst into our backyard, panting and covered in scratches. Everyone else was just setting the table for dinner, the same old bustle of holiday chaos. No one believed the garbled story Sam and I tried to spill about a moose-faced figure and bizarre clearing that tried to trap us. At that moment, I almost wished I could block it all out too. But as the sun sank lower, my mind refused to let go of the image of that tall, ragged shape. It was somewhere out there, in those depths of the forest, and I was certain it remembered us. Dinner that evening was supposed to be the high point of our holiday. Everyone crammed around Grandma's table, swapping stories and passing turkey like it was a relay race. But I couldn't focus on anything except what I had witnessed a few hours earlier with Sam. While everyone else bantered about football or joked about old family tales, my thoughts kept wandering to the figure with the moose-like head lurking out there in the darkening woods. The dining room felt too bright after the darkness of the forest. Every clink of silverware made me jump. I kept expecting to see that elongated face peering through the window, those hollow eyes watching us eat. The food turned to ash in my mouth. Even Grandma's famous stuffing, which I usually loved, felt like sawdust. The swirl of voices and the glow of candles couldn't blot out that creeping sense of unease. I glanced at Sam. He was barely touching his food. Every now and then he'd dart his eyes toward the window, as if expecting a tall silhouette to slip past. When Aunt Sandy asked him if he was feeling sick, he just shook his head and pushed mashed potatoes around his plate. The grown-ups shot us odd looks for being so quiet. I knew they chalked it up to silly childhood fears, some rumored ghost story or a product of too much imagination. But I noticed a few uneasy glances at the walls, where Grandma's native masks seemed to watch us, their carved eyes lit by flickering candlelight. If they had known what we actually saw out there, maybe they'd have believed us. Or maybe it was easier to pretend nothing was wrong. Uncle Jim was telling another one of his stories, something about a bear he'd encountered while camping, but I could tell even he was forcing the jovial tone. There was something in the air that night, a tension that went beyond our strange encounter. It was like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I watched Grandma carefully. She sat at the head of the table, picking at her food with unusual delicacy. Every few minutes she'd pause and cock her head slightly, as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. When she caught me staring, she gave me a small, sad smile that made my stomach drop. She knew something. I was sure of it. After dessert, some of the older cousins suggested a round of manhunt to break the tedium. Normally, the idea of running around at night, flashlights dancing in the dark, brought a spark of excitement. This time, my stomach twisted. Still, it seemed safer to be with a big group than wandering alone. I figured I'd stick close to everyone else and not stray more than a few yards from the back porch. Marie had been put to bed, lucky her. The rest of us bundled up and headed outside. There were 8 of us kids in total, ranging from my age up to Sam's older brother Pete, who was 15 and acted like he was too cool for family games but came along anyway. The cousins burst outside in a flurry of jackets and laughter. The yard sat under a thick canopy of stars, and the line of trees loomed like a fortress. Aunt Sandy switched on a big floodlight near the tool shed, which cast just enough glow for us to see the game's boundary. The light created a safe zone, but it also made the darkness beyond seem even more impenetrable. At first, it felt almost normal. People sprinting between tree trunks, calling out in mock bravado. I teamed up with Sam and we prowled the perimeter with flashlights. Leaves rustled as some cousins snuck by, trying to avoid being tagged. The familiar game helped push back some of the fear, though neither Sam nor I ventured anywhere near the forest edge. Occasionally, we found ourselves scanning the darkness, searching for a shape that didn't belong. Each time, a cousin would pop up instead, shrieking or laughing, which felt like relief and disappointment at the same time. Deep down, I worried I'd spot an antlered silhouette among the branches. The game went on for maybe 20 minutes before things went wrong. Pete had ventured farther than the rest of us, showing off as usual. We could see his flashlight bobbing near the tree line, hear him calling out taunts to whoever was it that round. Then his light went out. At first, we thought he was trying to be sneaky, but after a minute of silence, people started calling his name. No response. The game stopped as we all converged on where we'd last seen him, our flashlights creating a constellation of worried beams. We were about to give up on the last hidden cousin when someone shouted from across the yard, "Over here!" We rushed toward the sound, flashlights bobbing. A group of us converged on a dense cluster of bushes close to the trees. The beam swept over leaves, revealing a crouched figure, that missing cousin, trying not to breathe too loud. It was Pete, huddled behind a fallen log, but something was wrong with his expression. His face was pale, eyes wide with genuine terror rather than game-playing excitement. He wasn't looking at us. He was staring at something behind us. But behind him stood something else, a shape so tall it nearly blended with the shadows of the branches overhead. My pulse hammered as the flashlight beams caught slivers of torn fabric and what looked like fur along its neck. The antlers, jagged, decaying in places, stretched above the creature's head. It towered in silence, and the part of me that had been trying to forget the earlier encounter shattered in an instant. There was no mistaking the slender, twisted limbs or the elongated snout of a moose-like face. Its eyes reflected the flashlight glow, forming two pinpoints of malevolence. But this time, it was closer. Close enough that I could see details I'd missed before. Its skin wasn't quite fur and wasn't quite flesh, but something in between, like hide that had been partially tanned and left to rot. Symbols were carved into its antlers, the same kind of markings I'd seen on trees in the deep woods. All of us froze. Not a single joke, not a single breath wasted. The cousin in the bush turned around, and a split second passed before he realized what loomed just behind him. His face contorted into horror, and he scrambled out so fast he nearly collided with two others. The creature moved then, not toward us, but in a strange sideways motion, like it was circling. Its legs bent in ways that hurt to watch, and with each step, the ground seemed to indent more than it should, as if the thing weighed far more than its frame suggested. It made no sound, but I felt a vibration in my chest, a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. The entire group screamed at once. Someone dropped their flashlight. I stumbled in the rush to get back toward the house. Every instinct hollered that the creature could yank one of us off our feet at any moment. Footsteps pounded across the lawn, breath ragged, hearts hammering like frantic drums. Behind us, I heard something that still haunts me. Not a roar or a howl, but a sound like wind through a hollow tree, if that wind could form words. It wasn't English or any language I recognized, but somehow I understood the meaning. It was calling us back, inviting us to return to the woods, to the clearing, to whatever fate awaited those who wandered too far from the light. We crashed through the back door in a jumbled swarm, shrieking for the adults. Aunt Sandy nearly dropped the stack of dishes she was washing when she saw us all sweaty, shaking and yelling about something in the yard. The rest of the family quickly gathered. At first, they were skeptical. Some asked if we were pulling a prank, but the collective panic changed their minds. We all babbled over each other, describing the antlers, the face, the towering silhouette. Pete couldn't stop shaking. He kept saying it had touched him, that he'd felt its fingers brush his shoulder, and the spot where it made contact felt wrong, like frostbite and fever at the same time. When Uncle Jim rolled up Pete's sleeve, we all gasped. There were marks there, not quite scratches and not quite burns, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. That was when I realized nobody was laughing anymore. A hush fell, heavy with dread, as if acknowledging something beyond our comprehension had taken root in these woods. The house suddenly felt too small, windows too large, the backyard a yawning black hole ready to devour any of us who ventured out again. A few uncles locked the doors and flipped off lights to reduce visibility from outside. They tried to act calm, saying they'd go check things out, but I saw Uncle Jim's hands trembling as he loaded his shotgun. Dad pulled out his phone to call the police, but there was no signal. There never was good reception at Grandma's house, but tonight the phones were completely dead. Grandma stood in the corner, her eyes shut like she was recalling stories she'd heard long ago. Maybe warnings from the same people who once lived on this land. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but grave. My grandmother told me about them, she said quietly. The old ones who never left. They were here before the tribes, before anyone. The native peoples knew to leave them alone, to never go too deep into their territory. But sometimes, when the barriers grow thin, they come looking. Looking for what? Mom asked, her arm tight around my shoulders. Grandma's eyes opened, and they were filled with a sorrow that seemed ancient. For what was taken from them, for what was lost. They don't see time the way we do. To them, we're all trespassers, whether we arrived yesterday or 100 years ago. The lights flickered then, just for a moment, but long enough for us to see shapes moving past the windows. Not one creature, but several, tall and wrong and patient. They circled the house like predators, but they didn't try to break in. They just watched and waited. I retreated to the living room with Sam, pressing myself to the wall beneath those old masks. The hum of shaken voices and muffled sobs filled the house. It was the first time we'd ever considered not being safe in Grandma's home. Part of me wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but I couldn't deny the memory of those hollow eyes scanning us under the flashlight's glare. The night stretched on endlessly. We huddled together in the living room, no one willing to go upstairs or be alone. Every creak of the old house made us jump. Sometimes we'd hear that hollow wind voice calling from outside, using sounds that almost formed our names. Pete kept the spot where he'd been touched covered, but we could all see it spreading slightly, the strange marks growing like frost on a window. Grandma lit sage bundles and placed them at every door and window. She pulled out things I'd never seen before from hidden drawers. Old pouches filled with herbs and stones. Items wrapped in leather that she handled with extreme care. She spoke in a language I didn't recognize, and the masks on the walls seemed to listen. As dawn finally broke, the creatures retreated back to the woods. We watched from the windows as their tall forms dissolved into the tree line, moving with that horrible sideways gait. The marks on Pete's arm faded with the sunrise, leaving only faint scars that looked like they'd been there for years. We were no longer just telling ghost stories. We were living one. And outside, something monstrous knew exactly who we were. None of us kids ever went into those woods again. The adults tried to rationalize what had happened, some claiming mass hysteria or a bear encounter that our frightened minds had twisted into something worse. But I noticed they started locking doors that had never been locked before, and Uncle Jim made sure his shotgun was always loaded when he visited. Grandma never spoke of it again directly, but she taught me things over the years. How to recognize the signs when the barriers grew thin, what herbs to carry for protection, why you should never follow the lights in the forest, no matter how warm and inviting they seem. I'm much older now, but I still remember every detail of that Thanksgiving. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm back in that clearing with the glowing mushrooms, and I can feel something massive moving through the trees, searching for the children who stumbled into its domain. I wake up with the taste of earth in my mouth and the sound of that hollow wind voice calling my name. They're still out there, in the deep places where the old trees grow thick and the paths disappear, waiting for someone to wander too far from safety, waiting for the barriers to grow thin again. Sometimes I think about Sam's kids and Pete's and whether anyone's warned them about the woods behind Grandma's house, whether anyone's told them that some forests hold more than trees and shadows. But maybe it's better they don't know. Maybe it's better to let them believe the world is safer than it really is, at least for a little while. Because once you've seen what waits in the darkness, once you've heard it call your name, you can never quite feel safe again. Even now, decades later, I avoid woods that grow too thick and too quiet. I lock my doors when the sun sets, and I never, ever follow the lights that dance between the trees, no matter how beautiful they seem. The masks still hang on Grandma's walls. She's gone now. But the house remains in the family. Every Thanksgiving, we gather there, and every year, we make sure the children stay close to the house. We tell them it's because of bears or rough terrain. Anything but the truth. But sometimes, when the sun sets and the shadows grow long, I catch the older kids staring at the tree line with curious eyes, and I wonder how long before one of them decides to explore. How long before they learn what we learned that night. The woods are patient. They've been waiting far longer than any of us have been alive, and they'll wait long after we're gone. In the deep places where the barriers wear thin, the old ones still walk their ancient paths, antlered and eternal, remembering when all of this belonged to them alone. And sometimes, on cold November nights when the wind sounds almost like voices, I remember too. My name is Benjamin, though most folks call me Ben for short. I've always been a bit of an outdoorsman. When I was just a kid, Dad would take me out camping and fishing. I loved it. I always did. Now, don't get me wrong, I like the city life, grew up in it. Still live in one now. I like concerts, bars. I like having everything I need within a 5-minute drive. But sometimes a guy just needs to get away from it all. My buddies back at the office, they never got it. Always making jokes about me wanting to live out in the sticks or asking me why I'd rather spend my weekend shivering in a tent when I had a nice warm bed at home. Like any of them had ever slept outside a day in their lives. This past summer I was feeling that need to get out strong. I needed the smell of pine needles and campfire smoke. I wanted to hear owls at night and the sound of the creek running over rocks. I told myself that I'd head out to the Shadow Mist National Forest up in Oregon. I knew a few good spots for setting up camp back in those woods, places where I could disappear for a couple of days and not see another living soul. I packed my truck with my gear, my trusty old tent, sleeping bag, stove, lantern, everything I needed for a weekend alone. Hit the road right after work on Friday. 8-hour drive, but I didn't mind. Sometimes getting there is half the fun, right? I stopped at this roadside grill I knew of, grabbed a burger and a beer. By the time I got deeper into the woods, it was pitch black. Finally, I found my turnoff and headed down the old forest road, bumpy, full of potholes. The branches whipped against the sides of the truck and the headlights cut through the dust. Finally, I reached my clearing. Hell, if it weren't for the faint glow of the city lights off in the distance, I'd have been in complete darkness. But the stars... Damn, you don't get to see them like that in the city. I stretched my legs, took a deep breath. Yep, this was exactly what I needed. Unpacked the minimum this time, just tent, sleeping bag, and some food. I ate a sandwich and turned in. I was beat from the day. Figured I'd get a fire crackling in the morning and have some proper grub. The next day, that's what I did. Got a fire going, cooked some bacon and eggs, washed it down with strong coffee. Pure bliss, let me tell you. After that, I figured I'd do some exploring. It was always fun seeing what kind of stuff I could stumble upon in these woods. Plus, a walk would do me good. Hours went by. Just me strolling through the trees, enjoying the sun on my back. Now I've been in this forest before, but I never went too far off the familiar paths. I always liked the idea of getting a little bit lost, though. Makes you feel like a real adventurer, doesn't it? Well, this time I think I got myself more than a little bit lost. It wasn't long until I didn't recognize a thing. But hey, no big deal. I just backtracked a bit until I recognized a big old oak tree I'd seen earlier. Back at camp, I cooked up some sausages and beans, the good simple stuff. I watched the fire die down to glowing embers and lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at those crazy stars. I was thinking about that funny coworker of mine, always talking about how camping was like paying to be uncomfortable. Idiot. I felt a deep wave of satisfaction wash over me. I'd rather be out here than anywhere else in the world. I fell asleep with a smile on my face. The morning wasn't as bright for some reason. Cloudy, a little drizzly. Figured I might pack up and head home a bit early if the weather didn't let up. But before I had a chance to decide, I heard it. At first it was so faint I told myself it was my imagination. Kind of a rustling sound, mixed with something else. I sat stock still, listening. My heart was starting to pound a little faster. Then I heard it again, a little louder this time. It sounded like heavy footsteps, snapping branches underfoot. Whatever it was big, and it was coming closer. I froze. Adrenaline kicked in. Maybe it was a bear? I had never seen one out here, but you always hear those stories. I grabbed my axe. Not exactly ideal for a bear attack, but better than nothing. And then... silence. Absolutely nothing. It was like whatever had been out there had just vanished into thin air. I figured I must have been spooked by some deer or a raccoon. It had to be, right? Still, I kept a tight hold on that axe. Later that afternoon, I was doing the washing up when I heard it again. This time closer, and definitely no deer. It sounded like... God, how do I even describe it? It was bipedal, I know that much, and huge. Every step it took sounded like it would shake the ground. And then there was a grunt. A deep, guttural thing. It sent chills down my spine. My first thought was, get the hell out of here. I could be gone in 15 minutes. Back to the city, safe and sound, before this thing even knew where I was. But the other part of me, the stubborn part, whispered, stay and see what it is. I knew it was stupid. It was reckless. But damn it, curiosity is one hell of a drug. I decided I would stay, just for a bit longer, just to see. I was ready though. Axe in hand, my senses prickling. My heart was racing like it was trying to jump out of my chest. I saw it later that day. It was moving along the tree line, and for a moment the sun shone through a gap in the branches. Now my dad taught me a thing or two about hunting, so I've seen my fair share of animals. But what I saw in the woods? Damn, I don't have a word for it. It was huge. 8 feet tall, maybe more. Covered head to toe in a matted brownish fur. It had a long, flat face. Longer arms than any animal I'd ever seen. But what got to me the most were the hands. They weren't paws, and they weren't human, but they were something like both, with long, gnarled fingers. It loped along on its 2 legs, swinging its arms as it moved. I held my breath, watched it disappear deeper into the trees. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared. After that, the rain came down hard. Figured it was a good sign to pack up and go. I didn't break any speed records, let me tell you. Every cracking twig, every sudden noise had me whirling around looking for it. It was following me at first, I could tell. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the woods. I was nearly back at my truck when I finally saw it again, just standing there among the trees, still as a statue. Its eyes, I didn't want to think about those. But it was staring right at me. It wasn't threatening. More like it was observing. Like I was its science experiment. Now I'm no coward. But I admit it. I was getting scared. It wasn't until I threw a good-sized rock in its direction that it finally took off. Just vanished into the trees like the first time. I threw my stuff in the truck and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I hit that burger joint again. I ordered a double cheeseburger, fries, and the biggest chocolate shake they had. I guess the city boy in me needed a taste of civilization after all that. Never did go back to those woods. My buddies still poke fun, and I don't blame them. The story's pretty wild. Half the time I don't believe it myself. But then sometimes when it's real late at night and I see shadows moving outside my window, I wonder. The weeks following my return from Shadow Mist were unsettling, to say the least. I tried to go about my daily life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. It started small. A scratching sound at my bedroom window in the dead of night. The sensation of being watched when I walked to my car in the morning. I chalked it up to paranoia, told myself I was just shaken up from my experience in the woods. But then things started to escalate. One night, I woke up to find my living room in disarray. Furniture overturned, pictures knocked off the walls. And there, pressed into the carpet, was a single, massive footprint. It looked almost human, but the toes were too long, the ball of the foot too wide. I called the police, of course. They came, took some photos, asked if I had any enemies. But I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was nuts. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe the stress of work, of city life, had finally gotten to me. I considered seeing a therapist, but what would I tell them? That I saw a monster in the woods, and now I think it's stalking me? They'd have me committed. So I tried to ignore it, threw myself into my work, spent more time at the office. My coworkers noticed the change in me. The bags under my eyes, the way I'd jump at sudden noises. They'd joke about it, ask if I'd seen any more Bigfoots on my camping trips, if only they knew. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working late, the office empty except for me. The cleaning crew had already come and gone. I was just finishing up some reports when I heard it. That same heavy footstep I'd heard in the woods. It was coming from the hallway outside my office. My blood ran cold. I sat there frozen as the footsteps drew closer. Slow, deliberate. Like whatever it was knew I was there and was in no hurry. The fluorescent lights in the hallway started to flicker, and then, one by one, they went out. I dove under my desk, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped right outside my office door. I could hear heavy breathing, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air. The door handle turned. Slowly. So slowly. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to whatever God might be listening. The door creaked open. The smell hit me first. It was like wet fur and rotting leaves, with an underlying musk that made my stomach churn. I heard it shuffling into the room, its breathing growing louder. I dared to open my eyes, just a crack. And there it was. Those massive, gnarled feet. The matted fur. I looked up, following the line of its body, until I met its eyes. They glowed in the darkness, 2 pinpricks of amber light that seemed to bore right through me. It knew I was there. It had to. But it just stood there, watching, waiting. For what, I didn't know. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me, curled up under my desk, shaking like a leaf. It, looming over me, silent and still. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and left. Just like that. I heard its footsteps retreating down the hallway, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. I stayed under that desk until dawn broke. When I finally crawled out, my legs were cramped and my back ached. But I was alive. I half expected to find the office in shambles, but everything was exactly as it had been. No overturned furniture, no massive footprints, nothing to prove that what I'd experienced was real. Except I knew it was, just as I knew that this wasn't over. I quit my job that day, packed up my apartment and moved clear across the country. I told everyone it was for a fresh start, a new job opportunity. But the truth is, I was running. Running from something I couldn't explain. Something I wasn't sure anyone would believe. But even now, years later, in a new city with a new life, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. Watching. Waiting. Sometimes when I'm walking home late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. A flash of amber eyes in a darkened alley. And I'll remember that night in the office. And the creature from Shadow Mist. I don't go camping anymore. The thought of being out in the woods, alone and vulnerable, makes my skin crawl. My new friends don't understand. They see me as the city guy, always declining invitations for hikes or outdoor adventures. If only they knew the real reason. I've tried to research what I saw, spent countless hours poring over cryptozoology websites, reading accounts of similar sightings. But nothing quite matches up. Whatever it was that I encountered in those woods, whatever followed me home, it seems to be unique. Or at least, unique in that no one else has lived to tell about it. There are nights when I lie awake, staring at my bedroom ceiling, wondering if I'll hear that familiar heavy footstep outside my door. Part of me almost wishes it would happen, just so I'd know for sure that I'm not crazy. That what I experienced was real. But then I think about those eyes. That primal fear that gripped me when I saw it up close. And I pray that it never finds me again. Still, I can't help but wonder. What was it? Why did it follow me? What did it want? These questions haunt me, day and night. I've considered reaching out to experts, to anyone who might be able to shed some light on what I experienced. But I'm afraid. Afraid that drawing attention to it might bring it back. So I keep my story to myself. I go about my life trying to forget. But every time I see a news report about a missing hiker, or hear about strange sightings in the woods, I can't help but wonder. Is it out there still? Watching? Waiting? And if it is, who will be its next target? I've started to notice things again. Small things at first. A strange smell in my apartment when I come home from work. Objects moved ever so slightly from where I left them. It could be nothing. It could be my mind playing tricks on me, dredging up old fears. But deep down, I know. It's found me again. I don't know what to do. I can't run again. I can't keep living like this, always looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. But what choice do I have? Who would believe me? Who could possibly help? So I wait, and I watch, and I wonder when it will finally decide to show itself again, because I know it will. It's patient, whatever it is. It can wait. But so can I, and this time, I'll be ready. I have to be, because I can't live with this fear anymore. One way or another, this has to end. As I sit here, writing this down, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Even now, in the safety of my own home, I feel exposed, vulnerable, like prey. But I'm not prey. Not anymore. Whatever this thing is, whatever it wants, I'm done running. I'm done hiding. The next time I see those amber eyes in the darkness, I'm going to face them head on. Because the alternative, living in fear for the rest of my life, that's no life at all. So here I am. Waiting, watching, ready for whatever comes next. Because I know now with absolute certainty that something is coming. And God help me, I'm going to be ready for it. This is Benjamin signing off. If you're reading this, wish me luck. I have a feeling I'm going to need it. The air felt cool against my cheeks as I followed the narrow footpath, my breath forming small clouds in the morning chill. My dog, a stocky mixed breed with bright, alert eyes, padded alongside me, her muscles tense beneath her coat. She kept glancing up at me, seeking reassurance I couldn't give. It was early October, and the sun's rays were still stretching across the leaf-littered ground, creating long shadows that seemed to reach for us with dark fingers. I'd chosen this public stretch of woods for the quiet, hoping to enjoy a morning free from the crushing weight of everyday responsibilities. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, a maze of trails that few people bothered to explore this early. I remember noticing how unnaturally still everything seemed. Sure, there were distant bird calls echoing through the canopy, but the undergrowth felt oddly devoid of the usual rustling of small animals. My dog paused every few steps, her nose working overtime, nostrils flaring as she processed scents I couldn't detect. Each time she stopped, my stomach tightened. I felt that sharp twinge of caution, the same primal jolt that our ancestors must have felt when they realized predators might be stalking them through tall grass. The trail meandered through dense scrub, the path barely visible beneath fallen leaves that crunched too loudly under our feet. Eventually, the trail dipped toward a shallow creek bed, where the water gurgled over smooth stones. A cluster of leafless branches overhead formed a skeletal canopy, their bare limbs reaching across the sky like arthritic fingers. They looked like they'd host a roosting flock, but I didn't spot any birds right away. The absence of wildlife made my skin crawl. My dog's ears suddenly flicked forward, then back, and she let out a low, guttural growl that I'd never heard from her before. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Instinct screamed at me to stop moving. I froze mid-step, letting my gaze sweep across the creek and into the shadowy forest beyond. The sun sparkled on the shallow water, creating a deceptive scene of tranquility that contradicted every alarm bell ringing in my head. In that moment, a primal impulse seized me. Without conscious thought, my hand shot out to grab my dog's collar, shortening the leash until she was pressed against my leg. I dropped into a crouch, my knees protesting against the sudden movement. My heart hammered so hard I was sure anything within 50 feet could hear it. Every sense sharpened simultaneously, my body preparing for a threat I couldn't identify. I scanned the tree line with methodical precision. That's when I spotted them. A group of wild turkeys perched in the branches, their dark forms nearly invisible against the morning glare. They were massive birds, their bodies swaying slightly as they adjusted their grip on the branches. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over me. Just turkeys. That's what had my dog on edge. But the relief evaporated when I heard it. A deliberate rustle from behind us, too measured to be wind, too heavy to be a small animal. My dog's body went rigid against my leg, a barely audible whimper escaping her throat. I pivoted slowly, my joints stiff with tension, expecting to see a deer or perhaps another early morning hiker. What emerged from the brush made my mouth go dry. A man materialized from the undergrowth like a specter, dressed head to toe in military-grade camouflage that had rendered him nearly invisible. He cradled a compound bow in one hand, an arrow already nocked. His face was painted in earth tones, and his eyes, his eyes, were cold and predatory, fixed on something beyond me with laser focus. He froze when he spotted me, and I watched the calculation happen behind those hunters' eyes. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck standing out like cords. The mask of irritation that crossed his features was unmistakable. A predator interrupted mid-stalk, his carefully orchestrated hunt ruined by my bumbling presence. For what felt like hours but was probably seconds, we remained locked in that tableau. Him standing there with his weapon, me crouched with my terrified dog, and those oblivious turkeys rustling overhead. I could see his finger twitch near the arrow's fletching, and for one horrifying moment, I wondered if he was considering whether to eliminate the witness to his illegal hunting. I raised a trembling hand in what I hoped was a peaceful gesture, my throat too constricted to form words. His gaze shifted from me to my dog, then to the turkeys, and finally back to me. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a silent promise that I'd remember this encounter. Without a word, he melted back into the forest, moving with such practiced stealth that I lost sight of him within seconds. Only a faint rustle of leaves marked his passage. The encounter left me shaking. I remained crouched for several minutes after he disappeared, afraid that standing might draw him back. My dog pressed harder against me, her body trembling in sync with mine. When I finally found the courage to rise, my legs nearly buckled. The turkeys, still unaware of how close they'd come to death, continued their morning preening. We abandoned the trail immediately, taking the shortest route back to the parking area. Every shadow became a potential hiding spot, every sound a possible footstep. I'd hiked these woods for years, but they'd transformed in an instant from a place of peace to a hunting ground where I was no longer the apex predator. The walk back took an eternity. My dog stayed glued to my side, her usual curiosity about scents and sounds completely suppressed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that camouflaged figure following us, bow drawn. The rational part of my brain tried to argue that he was just a hunter, illegally pursuing game on public land. But the primitive part, the part that had kept our species alive for millennia, knew better. That man had looked at me the way a cat looks at a mouse, evaluating, calculating, deciding. When we finally reached my car, my hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice. The metallic jingle seemed to echo through the empty parking lot like a dinner bell. I practically threw my dog into the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. Only when we were miles away did my breathing begin to normalize. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hunter's face, painted for war, emerging from the forest. I researched local hunting regulations obsessively, confirming what I already knew. Bow hunting was strictly prohibited in those woods. The area was too close to residential neighborhoods, too popular with families. Yet someone had been there, armed and ready to kill, moving through the forest like he owned it. A year passed before I felt brave enough to venture into any wooded area alone again. When I finally did, I chose a different location entirely. A suburban edge trail known for its wide, well-maintained paths and scenic overlooks. This wasn't wilderness, it was nature domesticated, complete with interpretive signs and emergency call boxes every half mile. The kind of place where soccer moms jogged with strollers and elderly couples fed ducks at the pond. My dog had developed a wariness of wooded areas that matched my own. She no longer pulled eagerly toward the trailhead, but instead hung back, needing encouragement to proceed. We'd both been changed by that morning encounter, marked by it in ways that went deeper than memory. The parking area should have been busy on such a beautiful afternoon. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, golden sunlight filtering through changing leaves. Yet only 2 other cars sat in the lot, both empty, their windows reflecting the surrounding trees like dark mirrors. An elderly sedan with a faded bumper sticker and a mud-splattered pickup truck that looked abandoned rather than parked. As we started down the gravel path, the wrongness hit immediately. No chatter of voices carried on the wind, no rhythmic footfalls of joggers, no children's laughter from the playground near the pond. Even the omnipresent hum of traffic from the nearby highway seemed muted, as if the forest had thrown up walls to block out the outside world. My dog's behavior confirmed my unease. She moved with her tail low, ears constantly swiveling, stopping every few yards to test the air. Her nose worked frantically, processing information that her limited vocabulary couldn't communicate to me. All she could do was whine softly and press closer to my legs. Her usual confidence evaporated. I tried to rationalize the emptiness. Maybe there was a big game on TV. Maybe the weather forecast had predicted rain. Maybe everyone else had simply found better things to do on this particular afternoon. But these explanations felt hollow, like whistling past a graveyard. The forest knew something I didn't, and it was keeping its secrets. The trail wound through groves of oak and maple, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into a golden twilight. Beautiful, under other circumstances. Today, those same trees felt like they were closing in, their shadows too dark, their branches reaching too low. Every tree trunk could hide a watcher. Every cluster of bushes could conceal a threat. About a quarter-mile in, we passed the first interpretive sign, a cheerful placard describing local bird species. Someone had scratched deep gouges across the text, obliterating the information beneath. The vandalism looked fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. My dog sniffed at the base of the sign and immediately backed away, hackles raised. The wooden footbridge appeared around the next bend, spanning a shallow stream that usually attracted photographers and nature enthusiasts. Built just 2 years ago with treated lumber and steel cables, it was the trail's centerpiece, the spot featured in all the tourism brochures. Today, it stood empty, its planks gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. My dog planted her feet at the bridge's entrance, refusing to proceed. I'd never seen her react this way to a simple structure. She'd crossed this same bridge dozens of times before without hesitation. Now she pulled back against the leash, her whines escalating to sharp, panicked barks that shattered the oppressive silence. I knelt beside her, running my hand along her trembling flank while scanning the area. The stream below gurgled peacefully, its water clear enough to see the sandy bottom. The bridge itself appeared structurally sound, no visible damage or obstacles. Yet something about this place radiated wrongness like heat from a fever. That's when I noticed the smell. It crept into my awareness gradually, a sour, organic stench that made my stomach clench. Not quite decay, but something adjacent to it. Like meat left too long in the sun, or the smell that clings to clothes after a stay in a hospital. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, carried on air that had gone still and thick. Movement in my peripheral vision made me spin toward the far bank. Nothing there but swaying branches and dancing shadows. Yet I could have sworn I'd seen something larger. Something that didn't belong. My dog's barking intensified, echoing off the trees in a way that made it sound like multiple dogs, all raising an alarm. I made the decision to cross. Staying in one spot felt more dangerous than moving forward. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe it was the knowledge that the parking lot was now as far behind us as the trail's end was ahead. Either way, I practically dragged my protesting dog onto the bridge's planks. Halfway across, I understood her reluctance. The stench intensified, and with it came a sensation I can only describe as being examined. Not watched. That implies passive observation. This felt active, invasive, like unseen hands rifling through my pockets or fingers combing through my hair. My skin crawled with the phantom touch of evaluation. Below us, the stream continued its peaceful flow, but the water looked darker now, less inviting. I noticed things I'd missed before. A shopping cart submerged near the bank, its metal skeleton rusted and twisted. A scatter of cloth that might have been clothing caught on exposed roots. The detritus of human presence in a place that suddenly felt very far from civilization. We made it across the bridge, but the feeling of being studied only intensified. The trail narrowed here, hemmed in by thick undergrowth that reduced visibility to mere feet on either side. Branches reached across the path at face height, forcing me to duck and weave like a boxer avoiding punches. My dog stayed plastered to my legs, making forward progress difficult. A branch snapped somewhere to our left, A sharp, definitive crack that spoke of significant weight. Not a squirrel or bird, something substantial. I froze, straining my ears for follow-up sounds. Another crack, closer this time, accompanied by the rustle of disturbed foliage. Whatever was out there wasn't trying particularly hard to be quiet. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer would have bolted by now. A bear was unlikely in this suburban interface. A person? The thought made my throat constrict. What kind of person would be creeping through the brush parallel to the trail, maintaining pace with hikers? I forced myself to keep walking, fighting the urge to run. Running felt like it would trigger something, like a prey response that would invite pursuit. Instead, I moved with deliberate calm, keeping my breathing steady despite the scream building in my chest. My dog seemed to understand, matching my pace precisely, her body coiled like a spring. The sounds continued, sometimes falling behind, sometimes surging ahead. At one point, I could have sworn I heard breathing. Deep, rhythmic inhalations that didn't match my own rapid pants. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it as wind through leaves, but wind doesn't maintain a steady rhythm. Wind doesn't pause when you pause. Through a gap in the trees, I caught a glimpse of something that made my steps falter. A flash of pale color against the dark forest backdrop. Not quite white. More like the wan shade of exposed skin. It appeared and vanished so quickly I couldn't be certain I'd seen anything at all. But my dog had seen it too. She pressed against me hard enough to nearly knock me off balance, a keening whine escaping her throat. The trail entered what I'd always thought of as the tunnel, a stretch where the trees grew so thick overhead that even bright daylight dimmed to twilight. On pleasant days, it provided welcome shade. Now, it felt like entering the throat of some enormous beast, the shadows thick enough to hide anything. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sudden vibration making me jump. No signal. Of course. The screen showed the time, 3:47 p.m., but that seemed impossible. We'd been on the trail for what felt like hours, but surely no more than 40 minutes had passed. Time had gone elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that defied logic. The sounds from the brush had stopped, which somehow felt worse than their presence. At least when I could hear movement, I had a general sense of where the threat might be. Now the silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by our footsteps and my dog's rapid panting. Even the birds had gone quiet, creating a pocket of dead air that moved with us along the trail. Halfway through the tree tunnel, I saw them. Footprints in a muddy patch beside the path. Fresh prints, the edges still sharp and clean. They led from the trail into the underbrush and back again, a pattern that suggested someone had stepped off the path to observe something. Or someone. The prints were large, made by heavy boots with deep treads. Recent enough that moisture still gleamed in the deepest impressions. I tried to step around them, pulling my dog to the far side of the trail. That's when I noticed the second set of prints, smaller, made by worn sneakers. These tracks followed the same pattern but looked older, the edges already beginning to crumble. How many people had stood in this spot, watching the trail? How many times had hikers like me passed by, oblivious to the observers in the brush? The trail began its final descent toward the parking area, and with each step, my urgency grew. The forest seemed to press closer, the shadows darker, the silence more oppressive. My dog had given up any pretense of normal behavior, practically crawling along the ground, her tail tucked so far it touched her belly. Then I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand upright. Laughter, soft, breathy laughter coming from somewhere behind us. Not the hearty laugh of a hiker enjoying nature, but something else. Something that found genuine amusement in our fear. The sound slithered through the trees, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. I abandoned all pretense of calm. Grabbing my dog's collar, I broke into a run. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to catch my feet, but I didn't slow. Behind us, the laughter grew louder, joined by the crash of something large moving through the underbrush. No longer trying to hide, no longer content to simply watch. The parking area appeared through the trees like an oasis in a nightmare. My car sat alone now. The other two vehicles had vanished. I didn't pause to wonder where they'd gone, or if they'd ever really been there at all. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to hit the unlock button on my key fob. As I fumbled with the door handle, I risked a glance back at the trail. A figure stood at the forest edge, just visible in the shadow of the trees. Tall, unnaturally thin, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit right. The face was turned toward us, but the features were indistinct, blurred like a photograph taken with a moving camera. It raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been something else entirely. I drove home in a haze, checking the mirrors obsessively, taking random turns to ensure I wasn't followed. My dog huddled on the floor of the back seat, refusing to jump up onto her usual spot. It wasn't until we were safe inside my house, doors locked and curtains drawn, that I allowed myself to truly process what had happened. 2 encounters. 2 different forests. 2 experiences of being hunted by something that wore human shape but moved with inhuman intent. The first had been a hunter, yes, but a hunter who'd looked at me with calculation that went beyond annoyance at a ruined stalk. The second, I couldn't even categorize what the second had been. I started researching, diving into local forums and news archives. What I found made my blood run cold. Reports dating back years of hikers experiencing similar encounters. Always in isolated spots. Always that feeling of being watched, studied, evaluated. Some people reported finding makeshift blinds in the trees, places where someone could observe the trails undetected. Others described finding strange markings on trees, symbols that looked almost like tallies. The most disturbing discovery came from a series of posts on a local hiking forum. Multiple people described encountering a tall, thin figure in various wooded areas around the county. The descriptions varied slightly, but the behavior was consistent. Watching from a distance, following hikers while staying just out of clear sight, that horrible laughter when people showed fear. One post from 3 years ago made me close my laptop and check all my locks again. A woman described being followed through the same trail system I'd just escaped. She'd made it to her car, but when she'd gotten home, she'd found muddy boot prints on her back porch. As if something had followed her home, tested her doors, evaluated her security. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd felt watched in the woods? That someone had laughed at me from the bushes? Without evidence of a crime, they'd dismiss me as paranoid. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe the isolation of the trail and the memory of that first hunter had combined to create a threat from shadows and wind. But then I looked at my dog, still trembling hours later, and I knew better. Animals don't imagine threats. They respond to real danger with instincts honed over millennia. She'd sensed something in those woods, something that shouldn't have been there, something that watched and waited and followed. I don't hike anymore. I've found other ways to exercise, other places to find peace. The woods hold too many shadows now, too many spaces where things can hide. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about all the hikers who still use those trails, oblivious to what might be pacing them through the trees. I wonder how many close calls go unnoticed, how many near misses get written off as imagination. And sometimes, when I let my guard down, I remember that thin figure at the forest edge, waving goodbye like we were old friends. I remember that it knew which car was mine in an otherwise empty lot. I remember that it let me leave. The word that haunts me most is let. Because if it let me leave, that implies it could have chosen otherwise. And somewhere out there, on some lonely trail, someone else might not be so lucky. The woods are still watching, still waiting, And now, so am I. Watching my windows, waiting for the night when I see a familiar thin silhouette standing at the edge of my property line, finally ready to finish what it started. The first snowflakes of winter were falling on Michigan Avenue when Liz and I made the decision to leave Chicago. We were sitting in our favorite coffee shop, watching people hurry past with their collars turned up against the wind, when she turned to me and said, "David, I can't do this anymore." I knew exactly what she meant. The city had been slowly suffocating us both. For me, it was the endless grind of investment banking, 14-hour days staring at screens, watching numbers dance while my soul withered. For Liz, it was worse. As an ER nurse at Cook County, she saw the city's darkness up close. Gunshot wounds, overdoses, domestic violence. Each shift seemed to carve away another piece of her spirit. We'd been dreaming about escape for years, building Pinterest boards of remote cabins and saving what we could from our paychecks. But that snowy morning in 1995, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Liz's hands trembled as she held her coffee cup, or the new gray strands I'd noticed in my hair that morning. Whatever it was, we both knew. It was now or never. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, spending summers at my grandfather's hunting cabin. He taught me everything about the woods, how to track deer, start a fire in the rain, navigate by the stars. Those memories had sustained me through years of fluorescent-lit offices and endless spreadsheets. Liz was a city girl, born and raised in Chicago's suburbs, but she'd fallen in love with the wilderness during our weekend camping trips to the Boundary Waters. We spent months researching properties, focusing on northern Minnesota. We wanted something remote, really remote. No neighbors, no tourist traffic, just trees and silence. When we found the listing for the cabin, something clicked. One story, wraparound porch, stone chimney that needed some work. The realtor's photos showed it sitting alone in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines and old-growth maples. The nearest town was 20 miles away down a dirt road. "It's perfect," Liz whispered when we first saw it in person. Perfect wasn't quite the right word. The roof needed work. The porch sagged in places, and the whole place smelled like decades of wood smoke. But standing there in that clearing, listening to the wind in the trees and the distant call of loons, we both felt something we hadn't felt in years. Peace. The local realtor, an older woman named Martha, seemed oddly hesitant when we made our offer. "You sure you want to be out here?" she asked, glancing at the surrounding forest. "It gets mighty quiet in winter. Mighty dark, too." We assured her that's exactly what we wanted. Looking back, I wish we'd paid more attention to the worry in her eyes. We moved in that summer, trading our downtown condo for 200 acres of wilderness. The first few months were everything we'd dreamed of. Liz planted a garden, and I spent my days fixing up the cabin. We learned the rhythms of the forest, when the deer came to drink at the stream behind the house, which birds made which calls, how the light changed as the seasons turned. We made friends too, though slowly. Tom Jenkins, the sheriff, would stop by occasionally to check on us city folks. He was gruff but kind, always bringing fresh coffee and local gossip. Sarah Running Deer, who ran the general store in town, taught Liz about local plants and their medicinal uses. Her grandfather had been the tribe's medicine man, she told us, though she didn't talk much about him. Those first 3 years were close to perfect. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the trees gold, listening to the whip-poor-wills call in the gathering dusk. Sometimes, very late at night, we'd hear wolves howling in the distance, their voices echoing off the hills. It felt like we'd found our place in the world. Then spring came in 1998, and everything changed. The changes were subtle at first. Late March brought an unusually warm spell, melting the last patches of snow and waking the forest from its winter sleep. But something felt off about that spring. The birds returned as always, but their songs seemed different, hesitant, like they were afraid of attracting attention. The deer that had grown so comfortable around our cabin became skittish, bolting at the smallest sound. Liz noticed it first. She'd always been more attuned to the forest's moods than I was. One morning in early April, she was tending to her garden when she called me over. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a patch of ground near the tree line. The soil had been disturbed, but not by any animal I recognized. The marks were too deliberate, parallel lines about 6 inches deep, like something had been dragging heavy claws through the earth. They led into the forest before disappearing into the underbrush. "Probably a bear," I said, though I knew better. Bears had woken from hibernation hungry every spring we'd been here, but they left different signs: torn up logs, scratched trees, raided bird feeders. This was something else. That night, we heard the first scream. We were sitting by the fireplace, Liz reading one of her medical journals, me doing a crossword puzzle, when it cut through the quiet like a knife. It started as something almost human, a high, keening wail that made the hair on my neck stand up. Then it changed, dropping into a guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Liz grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "David," she whispered, "what was that?" I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could be a mountain lion. They can sound almost human sometimes." But we both knew there hadn't been mountain lions in these woods for decades. The screams continued through April and into May, getting closer each time. We started taking precautions, reinforcing the doors, keeping the shutters closed at night, bringing in extra supplies so we wouldn't have to drive into town as often. I dug out my old hunting rifle and kept it loaded by the bed. Sheriff Jenkins stopped by more frequently, though he never said why. He'd sit on our porch drinking coffee and telling stories about the old days, but his eyes kept drifting to the tree line. One afternoon, after Liz had gone inside, he turned to me with an unusually serious expression. "David," he said, his voice low, "you ever hear about the winter of '78? I shook my head. Bad winter, real bad. 3 families disappeared from these parts, just vanished. Cabins were found empty, meals still on the table, but the people... He trailed off, taking a long sip of coffee. Search parties found tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, not human neither. Something else. Before I could ask what he meant, he stood up and headed for his truck. At the steps, he paused. "You might want to think about taking a trip soon. Visit some family, maybe. Just don't stay here through summer." I wanted to dismiss his warning as small-town superstition, but something in his voice stuck with me. That night, I tried to convince Liz we should leave, just for a while. She surprised me by agreeing immediately. "There's something wrong here, David," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can feel it. The forest. It's like it's watching us." We made plans to leave the following week. Just a short trip, we told ourselves. Visit my sister in Milwaukee. Give whatever was out there time to move on. We never got the chance. 2 nights before our planned departure, everything changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, frost forming on the windows despite the mild spring weather. The electricity flickered and died, plunging us into darkness broken only by our fireplace's glow. And then we heard it. Heavy footsteps on the porch, moving with deliberate slowness toward our door. This time, they weren't going away. The footsteps stopped at our front door. In the silence that followed, I could hear Liz's breathing, quick and shallow, and the crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and I watched our breath form clouds in the flickering light. I reached for the rifle, moving as quietly as I could. Liz grabbed my arm, shaking her head frantically, but we both knew I had to check. The alternative was sitting there, waiting for whatever it was to come inside. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I crossed to the door. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in my hands. Through the window beside the door, I could see our porch, dimly lit by the quarter moon. Empty. But something was wrong with the shadows. They seemed to move independently of the swaying branches, flowing like oil across the wooden boards. Then I saw it. It stood at the far end of the porch, partially hidden by the darkness. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the porch ceiling. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. But it was the way it moved that turned my blood to ice. Each motion was fluid yet jerky, like someone had filmed a spider walking and played it back at the wrong speed. "David?" Liz's whisper seemed to hang in the frozen air. "What is it?" I couldn't answer. The creature's head snapped toward the sound of her voice, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. That's when I saw its face, or what passed for a face. Where features should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over an elongated skull. But the eyes... God, the eyes. They glowed a sickly yellow-white, like corpse lights in a swamp. It took a step toward the window. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. The creature stopped, cocking its head at an impossible angle. Then its face changed. A seam appeared where a mouth should be, widening into a grin that split its head almost in half. Rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the moonlight. It spoke. The sound wasn't anything human vocal cords could produce. A wet, clicking whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hungry," it said, the word stretching and distorting. "So hungry." I fired. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked as the bullet hit it, but there was no blood, no sign of injury. Instead, its flesh seemed to ripple and flow around the wound, sealing it instantly. Its grin widened impossibly further. "Run," I whispered to Liz. "Get to the car." The thing moved then, faster than I could track. One moment it was by the window, the next it was crashing through our front door in a shower of splinters and broken glass. I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but doing nothing to slow it down. Liz screamed. I turned to see her backing away from another set of glowing eyes in the kitchen doorway. We were surrounded. The temperature plummeted further. Frost crystals formed on the walls, spreading like ivy. The creature by the front door began to change, its form flowing and shifting like smoke. As it stepped into the firelight, I saw other faces rippling beneath its skin, human faces, twisted in expressions of agony. That's when I recognized one of them. Pete Anderson, a hunter who'd gone missing last fall. His face pushed against the creature's skin like a drowning man pressing against ice, his mouth open in a silent scream. "David!" Liz's voice snapped me back to reality. She had grabbed the kerosene lamp from the kitchen counter. "The cellar! Now!" I didn't hesitate. I fired once more at the nearest creature, turned, and ran. We practically fell down the cellar stairs, slamming the heavy door behind us. The creatures slammed against it immediately, the wood groaning under their weight. Liz was already fumbling with the old storm door that led outside from the cellar, our emergency exit. I could hear more of them moving around above us, their footsteps making the ceiling creak. The cellar door wouldn't hold much longer. "It's stuck!" Liz cried, pulling at the storm door's rusted hinges. I handed her the rifle and threw my weight against the door. It gave way with a screech of torn metal, letting in a blast of cold night air. We scrambled out just as the cellar door above shattered. The forest was alive with glowing eyes. We ran. Through the underbrush, over fallen logs, past trees that seemed to reach for us with gnarled branches. The creatures followed, their movements visible only as flickers of pale flesh and glowing eyes in the darkness. Their laughter, that horrible wet clicking sound, echoed through the woods, seeming to come from all directions. Liz stumbled beside me, gasping for breath. The kerosene lamp swung wildly in her hand, casting chaotic shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real and what was just tricks of the light. Behind us, something large crashed through the trees. "The road," I panted. "If we can just reach the road?" But in the panic and darkness, I'd lost all sense of direction. Nothing looked familiar. The forest itself seemed to have changed, becoming older, more primordial. The trees were bigger, their bark black and twisted, dripping with something that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. We burst into a clearing and stopped dead. In the center was a circle of standing stones, each one easily 12 feet tall. They weren't there before. I knew these woods, had hunted here for 3 years, and I'd never seen anything like this. The stones were covered in carvings that seemed to move when you looked at them directly, spiraling patterns that hurt your eyes to follow. "David," Liz whispered, clutching my arm. "Look." Between the stones, the air was wrong. It rippled like heat waves over hot pavement, but it was ice cold. Through the distortion, I could see something. Another forest, but not our forest. The trees there were pale white and seemed to pulse with their own light. Things moved between them. Things I couldn't quite see and didn't want to. A voice spoke behind us, different from the creature's wet whispers. "You weren't supposed to see this." We spun around. Sheriff Jenkins stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle pointed at the ground. But something was wrong with his face. It seemed to shift and flow like wax melting. "Tom?" My voice cracked. What is this?" He sighed, and the sound was not human. "A doorway, one of many. They've always been here since before the first people came to these woods. We tried to protect them, keep people away. But sometimes..." His face rippled again, features dissolving and reforming. "Sometimes they get hungry." The creatures were emerging from the trees now, surrounding the clearing. In the lamplight, I could see them more clearly. Wish to God I couldn't. Their bodies were constantly changing, flowing between different forms. Human faces appeared and disappeared in their flesh, all wearing expressions of terror or agony. "The missing people," Liz said. "All those missing persons cases." Jenkins nodded. "They need to take forms from our world to exist here, hunt here, feed here." His own form was becoming less human by the second. "Like I did 300 years ago." He raised his rifle, but Liz was faster. She hurled the kerosene lamp at him. It shattered, spraying burning oil across his dissolving form. He screamed, a sound that started human but rose to that terrible wet screech we'd heard in the woods. "Run!" I grabbed Liz's hand and we bolted past the burning shape that had been Jenkins into the dark woods. Behind us, the other creatures howled, not in pursuit, but in pain. The fire was spreading impossibly fast, racing up the trees like they were soaked in gasoline. We ran until our lungs burned, the glow of the fire lighting our way. When we finally stopped, the sun was rising. We were on the old logging road, about 3 miles from town. Behind us, a column of smoke rose into the dawn sky. The official story was that a campfire got out of control. The cabin burned, along with several acres of forest. They never found Jenkins's body, or any bodies. The standing stones weren't mentioned in any report. We didn't stay to answer questions. Drove straight to Milwaukee, then kept going west. Didn't stop until we hit Seattle. The ocean felt safer somehow. Fewer dark woods, fewer shadows. But sometimes, on cold nights when the fog rolls in thick off the Pacific, I swear I can hear that wet, clicking laughter. And in my dreams, I still see those standing stones and the other forest that waited behind them. The forest where the real horrors live. Liz sees them too. We'll wake up at the same time, both covered in cold sweat, having shared the same nightmare. Sometimes we talk about what happened, trying to make sense of it. Most times we don't. Last week, we got a letter. No return address, but the postmark was from that small Minnesota town. Inside was a single newspaper clipping about hikers going missing in those same woods. And below the article, in handwriting that seemed to crawl across the page, "They're still hungry." We burned the letter. But we both know it doesn't matter. Because the truth is, there are things in this world that are older than humanity. Things that wear our faces and walk in our shadows. They were here before us, and they'll be here after we're gone. And sometimes, in the dark places of the world, they get hungry. I still have the rifle. Keep it loaded. Keep it close. Not that it would do any good. We'd learned that the hard way. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet and the shadows too deep, it helps to have something solid to hold on to. Liz wants to move again, somewhere with fewer trees. I'm starting to think she's right. Because the worst part isn't the nightmares, or the memories, or even the knowledge that such things exist. The worst part is wondering if, one day, we'll look in the mirror and see our own faces beginning to shift and flow, like wax melting in the sun. Because once they mark you, once they know your face, they never really let you go. I've been a forest warden for over 25 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. I've dealt with everything from reckless hikers who think they're invincible to experienced backpackers who find themselves disoriented in the dense wilderness, bewildered by the endless expanse of trees. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered in the summer of 2012. My name is Jack Hawthorne, and I was stationed at Blackwood National Park, a remote wilderness area in the Pacific Northwest. It's a place where the ancient trees tower so high they seem to scrape the sky, and the fog rolls in so thick you could cut it with a knife. Blackwood is a place where the boundaries between reality and legend often seem to blur, a place where, if you listened closely enough, the forest whispered secrets you were never meant to hear. The summer of 2012 had been unusually dry, and with the looming threat of wildfires, I spent most of my days patrolling the trails, ensuring that visitors adhered to the strict fire regulations. The park was quieter than usual, with fewer tourists braving the sweltering heat and the risk of wildfire. But there was one group that stood out, a small family that had decided to camp deep within the forest, far from the designated camping areas. I first encountered them one crisp morning as I made my rounds. There was Thomas Sullivan, a man in his late 30s with a scruffy beard and eager eyes. His wife, Sarah, a petite woman with a warm smile and a cautious demeanor. And their young daughter, Emma, a precocious 8-year-old with wild curls and an insatiable curiosity. They were cheerful, excited to be in the wilderness, and eager to experience nature in its rawest form. "You folks know you're pretty far off the beaten path, right?" I asked, eyeing their heavy backpacks and camping gear. Thomas grinned, his eyes gleaming with a kind of reckless abandon. "That's the whole point, Warden. We're here for the full experience. The further from civilization, the better." I warned them about the dangers of camping outside the designated areas, but they seemed unfazed, even brushing off my concerns with light-hearted jokes. Sarah looked a bit nervous, but Emma was bouncing with excitement, pointing at every bird and squirrel she saw. "Just be careful," I said sternly. "Stay on the trails and make sure you have enough supplies. Cell reception is spotty out here, and it's easy to get turned around." They nodded, though I could tell Thomas was only half listening. As they headed off into the dense forest, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the way Thomas's eyes gleamed with that reckless abandon. Or perhaps it was just my instincts honed by years in the wilderness. But they were within their rights to camp wherever they wished, so I let them go, with one last reminder to be careful. A few days passed, and I didn't think much about the Sullivan family until I noticed that their car was still parked in the same spot near the trailhead. It wasn't unusual for people to spend a few days camping, but something gnawed at me, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. I decided to check on them, just to be sure they were okay. The hike to where they'd set up camp was about 5 miles off the main trail, through dense underbrush and along paths that were more animal tracks than human trails. It was the kind of place where few dared to venture, a place where the forest closed in around you, muffling the sounds of the outside world. As I approached their campsite, the first thing that struck me was the silence. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, even the distant hum of insects, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself moving more cautiously, my hand resting on the bear spray at my hip. The campsite itself was a mess. The tent was torn, one of the poles snapped in half, and the remnants of their gear were scattered across the ground. But what caught my attention most was the fire pit. It was surrounded by small, twisted figures made from sticks and twine, arranged in a circle around the ashes. The figures looked like crude representations of people, their limbs contorted into unnatural positions. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Mr. Sullivan? Mrs. Sullivan? Emma? Is anyone here?" There was no response. My heart raced as I searched the area, hoping to find the family safe and sound. But the more I looked, the more apparent it became that they were gone, vanished without a trace. I radioed for backup, and soon a search team was combing the forest. We searched for days, but there was no sign of the Sullivans. No tracks, no belongings, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The only clue we had was a notebook I found near the remains of their campfire. It belonged to Thomas, filled with sketches of the forest and notes about their trip. But toward the end of the notebook, the sketches became darker, more frantic. The last few pages were covered in drawings of strange creatures, tall, shadowy figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes blending into the trees. The notes became erratic, with phrases like, "It watches us," and "We are not alone," scrawled in the margins. The search was eventually called off, and the official report listed the Sullivan family as missing, presumed dead. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister had happened. I've always been a rational man, someone who believes in facts and logic. But after that summer, I started to question everything I thought I knew. I spent countless nights poring over Thomas's notebook, trying to make sense of the drawings and the cryptic notes. I even began researching local legends and folklore, desperate to find an explanation for what had happened. That's when I stumbled upon stories of a creature known to the indigenous tribes of the area, a being they called the Wendigo. According to legend, the Wendigo was a spirit of the forest, a malevolent force that preyed on those who ventured too deep into the woods. It was said to be a creature of insatiable hunger, one that could take on the form of a human or animal, but always with something off. Eyes that were too large, limbs that moved in unnatural ways. The more I read, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The Sullivans had camped in an area known for strange disappearances, a place where even the locals refused to go. And the sketches in Thomas's notebook, those twisted, shadowy figures, looked eerily similar to the descriptions of the Wendigo. I knew it sounded crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the Sullivans had encountered something in the woods. Something ancient and hungry. I tried to tell myself that it was just a legend, that there was a logical explanation for what had happened. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. I couldn't forget the silence at their campsite, the way the forest had seemed to close in around me, and those stick figures arranged around the fire pit like some kind of offering. I kept the notebook, though I never showed it to anyone else. I didn't want to be labeled as a crackpot, another warden who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. It was a reminder of that summer, of the family that had vanished without a trace, and of the secrets the forest kept hidden. Years passed, and I tried to put it behind me. But every time I patrolled that part of the forest, I felt it. The weight of the trees pressing down. The feeling that something was watching from the shadows. I'd hear things too. Strange noises in the night that I couldn't quite explain. Rustling in the underbrush, whispers carried on the wind, and once, the sound of footsteps trailing behind me. Though when I turned, there was no one there. Then, about 5 years after the incident, I got a call from a young couple who had decided to go hiking in the same area where the Sullivans had disappeared. They were frantic, saying they'd found something strange in the woods, something that made them feel like they were being watched. I rushed out to meet them, and when I arrived, they led me to a small clearing not far from the old campsite. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a rancid, rotting stench that hung in the air like a thick fog. The couple pointed to a large tree at the edge of the clearing, and that's when I saw it. There, hanging from the branches, were more of those twisted stick figures, just like the ones I'd found years ago. But these were different. They were larger, more intricate, and each one had something tied to it. Pieces of cloth, small bones, even strands of hair. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the tree, the ground beneath my feet soft and spongy. And then I saw what was causing the smell. At the base of the tree was a shallow pit, half covered with dirt and leaves. Inside were the remains of a body, badly decomposed and almost unrecognizable. But I knew deep down that it was Thomas Sullivan. His clothes, though tattered and stained, matched the description in the missing persons report. The sight of that body confirmed what I had feared all along, that something in those woods had taken the Sullivan family, something that was still out there, waiting. We called in the authorities, and the area was cordoned off for investigation. The official report listed the death as an animal attack, but I knew better. The way the body had been hidden, the stick figures hanging from the tree, it wasn't the work of any animal I'd ever encountered. After that, I refused to patrol that part of the forest alone. I didn't care what anyone thought. I'd seen enough, and I wasn't going to be the next one to disappear. To this day, I still don't know what really happened to the Sullivans, or what I encountered in those woods. But I do know this. There are places in this world where the lines between reality and legend blur. Places where the old stories are more than just tales to scare children. And sometimes, if you're not careful, those stories have a way of finding you. I left the Park Service a few years after the discovery of Thomas's body. The nightmares were getting worse, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I moved to a small town far from Blackwood Forest, trying to put as much distance between myself and those woods as possible. But even now, I can't escape it. Every so often, I'll hear something in the night. A soft rustling, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. And I'll find myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it's found me again. I can't help but think back to that summer, to the Sullivan family that vanished without a trace, and to the twisted figures hanging from the trees like dark omens. There are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, the only thing you can do is survive long enough to tell the story. But that doesn't mean you're safe. Because the forest never forgets, and neither does the thing that lives within it. As I sit here, writing this account, I can't help but wonder if sharing this story is wise. Part of me hopes that by putting it out there, I might find others who have experienced similar things, that together we might unravel the mystery of what lurks in the depths of Blackwood Forest. But another part of me fears that by speaking its name, by acknowledging its existence, I might be inviting it into my life once more. I've tried to move on, to build a new life away from the shadows of the forest. I got married, had kids of my own. but I've never told them about what happened in Blackwood. How could I? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd believe me and live their lives in fear of something they can't see or understand. But sometimes, when we're out camping or hiking, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for those elongated shadows, listening for whispers on the wind. And I'll hold my children a little closer, urging them to stay on the trail, to respect the wilderness but never to trust it completely. Because I know now that there are ancient things in this world, things that have existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone. Things that see us not as the dominant species we believe ourselves to be, but as prey, as playthings, as sacrifices to powers we can't comprehend. I don't know if what took the Sullivans was truly the Wendigo of legend, or something else entirely, but I do know that it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's not just confined to Blackwood Forest. What if there are other places, other forests, where similar entities lurk? What if they're spreading, growing stronger as we push further into their domains? These are the thoughts that keep me up at night, that make me double-check the locks on my doors and windows. Because deep down, I know that no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, a part of me will always be back in those woods, standing in that clearing, surrounded by those twisted stick figures and the lingering scent of decay. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Respect the wilderness, enjoy its beauty, but never forget that there are places where humans don't belong. Places where the old magic still holds sway, where ancient hunger still roams free. And if you ever find yourself in a forest where the silence is too deep, where the shadows seem to move of their own accord, remember the story of the Sullivans. Remember and run. Because in the end, that might be all you can do. Run and hope that whatever's chasing you isn't faster, isn't hungrier, isn't more patient than you are. And pray that if you do escape, it doesn't follow you home. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep listening. Because even though I've left the forest, I'm not sure the forest has ever truly left me. And in the whisper of the wind through the trees, in the creak of a floorboard in the dead of night, I'll always be listening for the call of the Wendigo, hoping against hope that it hasn't found me again. Because in Blackwood Forest, and perhaps in other dark corners of the world, the line between legend and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, the stories we tell around the campfire are more than just stories. Sometimes they're warnings. Warnings we do well to heed. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense that something's watching you from just beyond the tree line, don't ignore it. Don't brush it off as imagination or nerves. Because maybe, just maybe, there's something out there in the darkness. Something hungry. Something patient. Something that's been waiting a very, very long time for you to wander just a little too far off the path. And if you hear a whisper on the wind, a voice that sounds almost but not quite human, well then it might already be too late. But you can try running. It's what I did. And somehow, against all odds, I survived to tell this tale. But remember, just because you can't see it, doesn't mean it's not there. Just because you've left the forest doesn't mean the forest has left you. So be careful out there. And whatever you do, don't go looking for the Wendigo, because you just might find it. Or worse, it might find you.